Mr. President.
The senator from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I come from a different world, Mr. President. I come from the real world. I've been here just a couple of years, but this sort of rhetoric that we hear on the floor of the Senate in the last few weeks is amazing to me. The disinformation, the knowing, misleading statements that are made, that doesn't exist for very long in the real world, Mr. President, because there are rules and regulations out there where that's taken care of. But it seems that if you're good at it in this body and can get away with it long enough, that what Vladimir Lenin once said can be true, and that is this. It doesn't matter what you say is true. It only matters that you say it and say it and say it, and pretty soon, to the common folks in your country, it becomes a truth. Well, Mr. President, I think we have lived through a century where we've done nothing but disprove that as a free society here and as a leader of the free world. And I think what's at stake tonight in this vote is bigger than just a few changes in our tax code. Good grief. We could work for the next 10 years and not clean up every detail of this tax code. But this is the first step to bring sanity back to our country. Let me put a little perspective on this, Mr. President. Let's talk about what President Trump inherited when he took office in January of this year. We had 8 years of the lowest economic growth in the history of the United States, Mr. President, 1.9%. We had the lowest workforce participation rate in over 40 years. In the last 8 years, Mr. President, we borrowed 35% of every dollar that we spent by the federal government. This body borrowed before you and I got in the Senate. In the last 8 years, under the last administration, where under 6 years of that 8 years, the opposing party here in this body had a supermajority for 2 years, had a majority for 4. So for 6 years, that party had the White House and they had the majority in this Senate at least. And in those 8 years, they doubled our national debt from $10 trillion to $20 trillion this year. Even though last year, or the last year of the last administration, in 2016, our federal government collected more federal tax than any other year in our history. And the last few years have been the same. But why didn't that, with all that borrowing, even when the last administration said, okay, we need to fix infrastructure, we need to get the economy going, they put $1 trillion into fake infrastructure investments, Mr. President, and none of these parameters moved. We still had no economic growth. This is the same party that liberalized Social Security and Medicare to a point where they're not sustainable. And just in 14 years, both those trust funds go to zero. This is not about going to Medicare and Social Security and finding money to give to the rich, Mr. President. This is trying to figure out how to get the economy going so we can save Social Security and Medicare. It's no more complicated than that. But what we hear here are words like shameful, ridiculous. I think what President Trump walked into here was shameful and ridiculous. In the United States, the wealthiest country in the history of the world, to have those sorts of performance parameters is ridiculous. It is shameful. There will be a day of reckoning, and it's today, Mr. President. Our president took that seriously. He said that job one is growing the economy. And let's put that in perspective. He said that in this first year of his administration, he wanted to focus on 3 things that would grow the economy. One is he wanted to pull back on regulations. And I'm here to tell you today that over 860 of the most onerous regulations and rules have been reversed so far this year. The second thing President Trump said is he wanted to work on energy. Well, we got the Keystone Pipeline working. He actually moved on stopping the Clean Power Plan that was thwarting the energy production in this country. And in this bill tonight, we will open up the ANWR production capability to give us capability in the energy side of our economy. The third thing the president said he wanted to do was change our archaic tax plan, not to give money to the rich, Mr. President, but to open our companies and our workers to be more competitive with the rest of the world. For the last decade, maybe even the last 30 years, Mr. President, I have lived this in my career. In 40 years, I've watched U.S. competitiveness decline and decline and decline. Why? Because of 2 reasons. Our federal government grew out of any proportion In 2000, the size of our government was $2.4 trillion, Mr. President. Last year, it was $4 trillion. That's under one Republican administration and one Democratic administration. But we poured regulation on top of regulation. We liberalized all of our social programs to a point that we cannot afford it. And the second thing we did is we loaded on to this tax situation where we lost our competitiveness with the rest of the world. The rest of the world lowered their tax rates while we actually increased ours. They reduced their regulations while we increased ours, and we just simply lost our competitive edge, such that today, Mr. President, 2 out of every 3 acquisitions regarding a U.S. company are U.S. companies being bought by a foreign company. Now, that's a C corporation. In many cases, it's an S corporation. And why is that? It's because of the tax arbitrage, the difference between our 35% corporate tax rate and the average of 18% in Asian countries and 21% in Europe. And all we're doing here is to try to reach to some point of being reasonably competitive with the rest of the world. So this president walked into a disaster, Mr. President. And what we've seen in the first year are dramatic results. 2 million new jobs have been created this year, 860 regulations reversed. Illegal crossings of the southern border are down 60%, Mr. President. We passed a bill in this body, 97-2, that allows a department head in the Veterans Administration to remove people for cause, for lack of performance. And guess what? So far this year, over 500 people have been asked to leave because of performance reasons in our Veterans Administration. That's something that both Democrats and Republicans should be proud of. We also see a Department of Education that has removed 300 people for the same reason. CEO confidence is at a 20-year high, Mr. President. Consumer confidence, despite what the other side wants to tell us, is at a 16-year high, and many studies are proving that today. But I want to tonight clear up some of the absolute unbelievable mistruths and myths about this bill being perpetrated. We heard several just in the last hour here on this floor, Mr. President. The first, the great one, I love this. This tax plan is only going to help the wealthy. We're going to tax the low-income people in America, and we're going to give it to the billionaires. Mr. President, let me just give you some examples here. A median income family today, family of 4 who work, a family of 4, 2 kids, who make a median income of $73,000 a year, is going to get a $2,200 tax reduction. That's a 60% reduction in their federal tax rate, Mr. President. A single working mother, as an example, with 1 child at home. Now, this is a parent that has to find child care, has to find her way to work, gets very little help from family or friends, does it on her own. I know many people like this. That person is going to get a 75% tax cut in this bill, Mr. President. Beyond that, today, 52% of households in America, this is before this bill, 52% of households in America pay 0 federal income tax, Mr. President. But this bill goes further. Up to 6 million people will potentially be removed from the tax rolls because of this bill. Now, I'm just a simple business guy, Mr. President, but I just look at the facts. These are mathematical facts here. There's no projection, no opinion. This is part of this current bill that belies half of the mistruths you just heard in the last hour on this floor. The second one is a process question. Of course, this is what we always hear the minority party say. I dare say, as an outsider, I heard Republicans say this in the last 6 years, where there's no transparency. Oh, we didn't have due process. There's no regular process, no regular order. Well, Mr. President, in the last few years, there have been over 70 public hearings, Senate hearings, in committees about tax reform. This particular bill has been in full regular order. Yes, it was done in reconciliation, but that is a regular order. I personally would have preferred not to have done that, but it's within regular order. It went through committee. Amendments were put up and passed and debated in committee. Then a bill was brought to the floor. We voted on amendments here on this floor, and then it went to a full vote and was passed, or will be passed tonight, Mr. President. This tax plan, the third myth, this plan will not generate economic growth. This is a really rich one, Mr. President, because most of the people saying that have never written their signature on the front of a check. They just simply haven't been in business. And yet these are now the newfound experts in this body who say, well, this is not going to grow the economy. Of course it's not. We need bigger government to grow the economy. Haven't we proven that? No. We've disproven that. If anything, over the last 8 years, Mr. President, we have proven that bigger government does not correlate with a better growing competitive economy. What this bill simply does is it gets government back out of the way to some degree, helps us become competitive with the rest of the world, and ignites this economy. Let's just look at what is being said about this. First of all, it's been estimated that nearly 1 million new jobs will be derived because of this bill. It's estimated that annual incomes of working Americans will go up somewhere between $4,000 and $9,000. That's in addition to the tax cuts, Mr. President. That's because of the demand for labor in a growing economy will create rising wages. The other side said, well, to get rising wages, you need to increase minimum wage. That's the wrong way to look at this thing. This bill, I can tell you from personal experience, will create demand for labor, and that labor will increase in price. GDP will grow somewhere between 3 and 5% over the next decade. I actually believe it'll be much more than that. The big one in my mind is by eliminating the repatriation tax, and by the way, we're the last country in the world to still have this archaic tax, which we collect no tax on today, but eliminating that brings almost $3 trillion, over $2.6 trillion back in this country. Mr. President, now the other side said, well, that's not going to get in the economy. It's going to be paid in dividends or paid down debt and all that. Guess what? In a capitalistic society, that is all contributory. It all adds to the aggregate benefit of growing the economy. Capital formation is part of what created this economic miracle in the first place. The last 70 years in America has been the greatest period of economic growth in the history of humankind. I would argue, Mr. President, as a 40-year experienced veteran of the business community here, as the only Fortune 500 CEO in the Senate and in all of Congress, I would argue that this economic windfall that we've experienced over the last 70 years in America is based on three things. On the top of the best workforce in the history of the world, it's innovation, capital formation, and the rule of law. And quite frankly, because of regulations in this body over the last 15 years and because of our tax code, we have taken those for granted. Tonight, we begin to reverse that. The next claim I want to debunk is that this tax plan adds $1 trillion. I love this one. This tax plan is going to add $1 trillion to the debt. This is from the other side that administered over doubling our debt in the last decade. Mr. President, no other president in the history of our country prior to the last administration added $10 trillion to the debt of this nation. There's no bigger debt hawk in this body than I. And I can tell you, this is what brought me into the political arena. This $20 trillion of debt is the beginning. It's not the end of the story. Unless we do something today about our federal debt, it's going to grow $11 trillion as the latest estimate over the next decade. Most of that is in the mandatory side, Mr. President. To solve this debt crisis, clearly we have to grow the economy. But we will not solve the debt crisis only by growing the economy. But we will not solve it unless we start by growing the economy. Excuse me. We're told by the Joint Committee on Taxation and by the Congressional Budget Office. And both of these modeling groups I have personal problems with, but even if you take their worst case scenarios, Mr. President, you only have to grow the economy 0.2% per year. That's growing from 1.9%, which is the average baseline of the last 8 years, growing it by 0.2% to 2.1% for the next decade. Now, Mr. President, there's only been one time in the last one decade, in the last 70 years, where this economy didn't grow more than 2.5%. And in that decade, it grew 2.3%. So in no decade since World War II have we grown less than 2.3%. In addition, CBO says, well, we got to grow to 2.3%. Well, Mr. President, the last 2 quarters are already over 3%. Fourth quarter looks like it will be as well if we pass this tax bill tonight. It just seems to me that the people who have experience in the real world economy know that investing in our workers is the best investment we can make. And that's what this tax bill does. Don't be confused by the rhetoric. Members of the other body in the last hour said there's going to be a day of reckoning. You know what? There is. Because I believe that the other side have failed the working poor in this country. The best example is Obamacare, perpetrated by the supermajority of 60 votes on the other side, and we know it's now collapsing under its own weight. But this is what they've done to the working poor in America, Mr. President. In 2014, it's been that way in the last 3 years as well. But 2014 is the last year we can get from the IRS. Under Obamacare, the IRS fined 8 million people in America $2 billion, Mr. President. And the irony of that is half of those people make less than $25,000. Now, Mr. President, that is outrageous. And for those same people to beat their chest now about this being for the rich, it is further outrageous. I'll close with this. This bill, the biggest argument they make is that this is for the rich. Well, and the rich are not paying their fair share and all that. Look, the top 1% today pay about 40% of all tax revenues that we have. The top 10% pay over 70%. That's before this bill, and that's going to be true after this bill, Mr. President. But what's going to be also true is the fact that working men and women of America will find that their place of employment, whether it be a one-man self-proprietorship, one-woman self-proprietorship, or a major corporation, those companies in a global economy are going to find themselves more competitive because of what President Donald J. Trump is doing in this tax bill and what we're backing up tonight. I argue that this is a historic day, not just because of tax relief for the working men and women of America or building competitiveness for those same people around the world, but for our kids and grandkids, Mr. President, so that we can begin to deal with this huge growing debt. People say, well, you're adding debt to it. No, this is an investment. And by the way, it's not $1.5 trillion, Mr. President. They know that $500 billion of that, a third of it, is this policy versus law. They know that, but it still makes a better story. They also know that $200 billion of that is fake cost because it says if you eliminate the way it's scored right now, if you eliminate the repatriation tax, the Joint Committee on Tax and Congressional Budget Office, in their infinite wisdom, say, well, that's going to cost you over $200 billion. Mr. President, we don't collect $200 billion today in repatriation tax. This is what, as an outsider, I look at and I cannot believe that we sit here and talk about these fake numbers that way. But, Mr. President, the President of the United States has a vision for our country. We need to rise up and be competitive again in order to deal with this long-term tax situation. But more importantly, or as importantly, to be able to afford to do the right things for our people. When we have hurricanes, when we have fires, we don't have the resources to do that. Every dime we're spending behind these hurricanes and behind the fires and behind all the things we're doing is borrowed. Every dime we spend on our military today, Mr. President, is borrowed money. The only way to eventually change that is to begin to grow our economy. This is only one of many steps that are required. But this tonight becomes historic because you can't do the others unless you make this economy competitive. I want to praise our President tonight for having the guts to stick through this process, but we're going to pass this bill tonight and make America great again because we're going to begin to make America competitive again. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.